The founding fathers of our country have been a source of interest to me for quite some time. And of these men of renown, Benjamin Franklin is perhaps my favorite. Not only because of his wisdom, but also of his wit, which is clearly seen in his writings. He was a man of many layers, which makes him, to me anyways, that much more fascinating. This being especially true when he made a list of virtues, and he was intent on inquiring all of these virtues. It was a list that he was so proud of, that he openly shared it with many of his friends, one of which was a Quaker, who looked over the list and then readily pointed out to Franklin, "You missed one." And Franklin goes, "No, I don't think so." And his friend told him, "Yeah, you did. Humility." And then his friend went on to point out to him the many instances wherein Franklin had been guilty of pride. Franklin had to acquiesce, and he had to add humility to the list. Now, Franklin is quoted as having said, "There is perhaps no one of our natural passions so hard to subdue as pride. Disguise it, struggle with it, beat it down, stifle it, mortify it as much as one pleases. It is still alive, and every now and then will peep out and show itself." Now, Franklin clearly shows how difficult he felt gaining humility was going to be. And it would be a battle that he would fight the rest of his life, as seen in another statement made on the same subject. "Even if I could conceive that I had completely overcome it, I would probably be proud of my humility." And there again you can see his wit. Franklin was so concerned about his lack of humility that he taught himself how to fake the virtue. Quoting again from Franklin, "I cannot boast of much success in acquiring the reality of this virtue, but I had a good deal with regards to the appearance of it." Now, when I read that quote, I was reminded of a group of religious people some years back who were so fixated on humility that what they did was they changed their name, and they simply became known to themselves and others as the humble people. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, "Therefore let him who thinks he stand take heed lest he fall." The minute you got humility and you're proud of it, you've lost it. And that's one of the things Franklin saw. And that's one of the things apparent with this group who wanted to be called the humble people. That by and through that title, that designation, that name, they weren't humble. The Bible is replete with warnings about inherent danger in pride. In the book of Obadiah, God demonstrates through the vision that he had provided to Obadiah how Edom would be humbled, and surely they were. In the writings of Solomon found in the book of Proverbs, time after time after time, Solomon warns about the peril of pride and arrogance. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling, is what Solomon writes in Proverbs 16 verse 18. And of the 7 things which are seen as an abomination before God, the first one that's mentioned in Proverbs 6 and verse 17 is a haughty eyes. Jesus, on his part, went to extraordinary extents in order to make manifest the import of humility as recorded in John chapter 13. Now, can you imagine what it must have been like to see the Son of God, who is involved in the creation of all things, stooping low and washing the feet of his disciples? How would you have reacted? Would you have been like Peter, who wanted no part of the Master washing his feet? Jesus said to Peter, "What I do you do not realize now, but you shall understand hereafter." Paul writes in Romans 12 and verse 2, "But be transformed by the renewing of your mind." It is imperative that mankind undergo a renewal of mind in order to embrace a mindset in accordance with what it is that God desires. That being seen, a mindset on the Spirit in Romans 8 and verse 7. But also, pay attention to what Paul continues in his thoughts in Romans 12. Because when you look at verse 3, you find the following. For through the grace given to me, I say to every man among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith. It is the desire of God that mankind come to understand and adopt humility into the very fabric of life. This can only come about because there's been a renewal of mind. Now again, notice the words of Peter. Clothe yourself with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. That reading is taken from 1 Peter, the 5th chapter, and verse 5, and into a little bit of verse 6. Now it is interesting, if you were to take and lay side by side the writings of James as well as that of Peter's, and you'd notice any number of similarities. Notice exactly in James, and it's not fresh in my mind or I'd quote it for you, but in James 4 and verse 6, but he says, I give a greater grace. Therefore, he says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And if you drop down into verse 10, humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. But go back into that one middle verse. You got 6, you got 10. Look at verse 8. Draw near to God. He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. In order to draw near to God, there must be the purification of the heart. There is a direct correlation between the heart and their mind. And why wouldn't there be? Because the heart, the inner being, is the reflective seat of the intellect, the emotion, and the will of the individual. And the only acceptable attitude by which one can approach God in a favorable fashion is one that is characterized by total, sincere humility. We need to learn not to be double-minded. Rather, let us learn and embrace what it truly means to be humble-minded.